Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are pulling back the curtain on some of the most consequential climate stories unfolding right now across the globe. From the Himalayas to the halls of the European Union, from Elon Musk's belching data centers to the ballot boxes of Nepal, the battle over our planet's future is being fought on every front.
I'm Maya Clarity, and what we've uncovered tonight is a pattern that should alarm every single one of you watching. On one side, we have institutions and regulations actually making progress on decarbonization. On the other, we have billionaires and geopolitical tensions threatening to undo decades of climate action. The through line is power: who has it, who's losing it, and who's willing to burn the planet to keep it.
We've got 4 major stories tonight, and I want to warn you, by the time we connect the dots between all of them, you're going to see just how interconnected this climate crisis really is. We're talking about a democratic uprising in one of the most climate-vulnerable nations on Earth. We're talking about a corporate ranking that exposes which car companies are walking the walk and which are just greenwashing.
We're also diving into a nature investigation showing how climate change and geopolitics are converging to threaten the water supplies of nearly 2 billion people. And we're going to look at how one man, Elon Musk, is simultaneously positioning himself as a champion of electric vehicles while running some of the dirtiest data centers on the planet. The hypocrisy is staggering, and we've got the receipts.
So buckle up. This is Truth Report, and tonight, we're following the money, the emissions, and the power. Let's get into it.
Our first story takes us to Nepal, a nation that sits at the literal front line of climate change. Nestled in the Himalayas, Nepal is home to some of the fastest melting glaciers on Earth. And on Thursday, its citizens head to the polls in what Al Jazeera is calling a pivotal election, one that comes just months after historic protests toppled the sitting government.
Let's set the stage here. Nepal experienced massive youth-led protests that brought down the government. These weren't just political grievances, they were fundamentally tied to a generation watching their country's glaciers disappear, their water supplies dry up, and their agricultural systems collapse, while their leaders did nothing. This is a nation where climate change isn't some abstract future threat. It's happening right now, in real time, to real people.
And what makes this election so critical from a climate perspective is that Nepal sits in one of the most vulnerable geographic positions imaginable. The Hindu Kush Himalayan region, which Nepal is part of, has been called the third pole because it contains the largest store of ice outside the Arctic and Antarctic. Studies have shown that these glaciers have lost nearly a third of their ice since the early 2000s, and the rate of loss is accelerating.
So when we talk about who the contenders are in this election, we need to understand that the stakes aren't just political, they're existential. The question facing Nepali voters is whether their next government will take meaningful action on climate adaptation, on glacier monitoring, on flood preparedness, or whether it will be more of the same corruption and inaction that drove people into the streets in the first place.
The protests that toppled the previous government were remarkable in their scale and their composition. We saw students, farmers, urban workers, and climate activists marching together. This wasn't a narrow political movement. It was a broad-based uprising against a system that had failed to protect its people from both economic hardship and environmental catastrophe. Nepal loses hundreds of lives every monsoon season to floods and landslides made worse by climate change.
And here's where it gets really interesting from a geopolitical standpoint. Nepal is wedged between 2 massive powers, India and China, both of whom have enormous stakes in Himalayan water resources. The glaciers that are melting in Nepal feed rivers that sustain over 1 billion people downstream. So this election isn't just about Nepal's domestic politics. It's about who controls the narrative on Himalayan climate adaptation in a region that is becoming increasingly contested.
What we're watching in Nepal is a test case for something the whole world needs to figure out. Can democratic movements born out of climate frustration actually translate into governments that take real climate action? Or will the same old power structures reassert themselves? The contenders in this race include established party leaders and newer faces elevated by the protest movement, and how they balance economic development with environmental protection will determine the fate of millions.
And let's be very clear, the international community has failed Nepal repeatedly on climate finance. This is a country that contributes virtually nothing to global emissions but bears some of the heaviest consequences. The glacial lake outburst floods alone have devastated communities. If the new government can't secure real climate adaptation funding from wealthy nations, no amount of domestic policy will be enough.
It's a story we'll be watching closely. Now let's shift to a very different arena, the European Union, where regulation is actually working, and we have the data to prove it. A new Carmaker league table has been released, and it shows that EV supply chains are getting cleaner. And the reason? Strong EU rules that are forcing the industry's hand.
This is the kind of story that the fossil fuel lobby doesn't want you to hear, because it demolishes one of their favorite talking points. For years, we've heard the argument that electric vehicles aren't really clean because their supply chains, the mining, the manufacturing, the battery production, are just as dirty as combustion engines. Well, this new ranking blows that argument apart.
According to reporting from CleanTechnica, the ranking evaluates the world's largest car makers on the environmental and social impact of their entire supply chains, not just tailpipe emissions, but the carbon footprint of the steel, the aluminium, the battery materials, everything. And what it found is that the companies operating under strong EU regulations are making measurable, significant progress in cleaning up their supply chains.
Let's talk about what's actually driving this. The EU has implemented a suite of regulations including the battery regulation, which requires supply chain due diligence and carbon footprint declarations for batteries sold in Europe. There's also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which puts a price on the carbon embedded in imported materials like steel and aluminium. These aren't voluntary guidelines, they're binding rules with real teeth.
And the results speak for themselves. Car makers that are subject to these EU rules are sourcing lower carbon steel, investing in cleaner aluminium smelting processes, and demanding better environmental practices from their battery suppliers. The league table shows a clear correlation: stronger regulation equals cleaner supply chains. It's not complicated. It's not magic. It's policy working exactly as designed.
Now, the rankings also expose the laggards, and this is where it gets uncomfortable for some major automakers. Companies that have been dragging their feet on supply chain transparency, that have been lobbying against tighter regulations, show up near the bottom of these rankings. And we should name them. The companies fighting hardest against EU environmental rules tend to be the ones with the dirtiest supply chains. That's not a coincidence, that's a business model built on externalizing environmental costs.
What's particularly important about this story is the timing. Right now, there are powerful forces, including certain political factions in the US and industry lobbyists in Europe, pushing to weaken or delay these very regulations. They argue that the rules are too burdensome, that they'll make cars more expensive, that they'll hurt competitiveness. But this league table proves the opposite. The companies that have embraced cleaner supply chains are also the ones positioning themselves for long-term success.
And let's zoom out for a second. The steel and aluminium industries alone account for roughly 10% of global carbon emissions. If EU regulations can force automakers to demand cleaner materials, that creates a ripple effect across entire industrial sectors. This isn't just about cars, it's about transforming heavy industry. That's the kind of systemic change that actually moves the needle on climate.
The lesson here is clear, and it's one that policymakers everywhere need to internalize. Voluntary commitments from corporations are worth the paper they're printed on, which is nothing. Binding regulations with enforcement mechanisms are what drive real change. The EU is proving that right now, and the data in this Carmaker league table is the evidence.
Exactly right. And speaking of water and geopolitics, let's turn to what might be the most consequential story we're covering tonight. A new piece published in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, is sounding the alarm on how climate change and geopolitics are converging to threaten water supplies for billions of people. But it also offers a remarkable ray of hope in the form of a 60-year-old treaty.
The story centers on the Indus Waters Treaty, signed in 1960 between India and Pakistan with the help of the World Bank. This treaty governs the sharing of water from the Indus River system, which flows through some of the most contested territory on Earth, including Kashmir. What makes this treaty extraordinary is what it has survived: multiple wars, including the 1965 and 1971 conflicts, the Kargil crisis of 1999, and decades of simmering tensions that have brought these two nuclear-armed nations to the brink.
And now it faces perhaps its greatest test yet: climate change. The glaciers that feed the Indus River system are losing mass at an alarming rate. Nature reports that the Hindu Kush Himalayan glaciers have experienced significant ice loss, and projections suggest that even under moderate warming scenarios, the region could lose a substantial portion of its remaining glacier volume by the end of the century. That means the rivers that currently sustain nearly 2 billion people in South Asia are facing an existential threat.
Let's break down why this matters so concretely. The Indus River system provides water for agriculture that feeds hundreds of millions of people in Pakistan and northwestern India. Pakistan, in particular, is heavily dependent on Indus waters for irrigation. We're talking about the backbone of the country's food production. As glaciers melt, there may be a short-term increase in water flow, but the long-term trajectory is devastating: reduced water availability precisely when demand is increasing due to population growth and rising temperatures.
And here's where the geopolitics become terrifying. India, which controls the upper reaches of several Indus tributaries, has been building hydroelectric dams that Pakistan views as a threat to its water security. There have been multiple disputes brought to international arbitration. In recent years, tensions have escalated, with India at one point threatening to revisit the treaty entirely. When you combine dwindling water resources with nuclear-armed rivals and deeply entrenched territorial disputes, you have the ingredients for catastrophe.
But, and this is the crucial part, nature's peace argues that disaster is not inevitable. The Indus Waters Treaty, for all its imperfections, has held. It has provided a framework for dialogue even when everything else between India and Pakistan has broken down. The article argues that this treaty should serve as a blueprint for other regions facing similar climate-water geopolitical crises, places like the Nile Basin, the Mekong Delta, Central Asia's Aral Sea region, and the Tigris-Euphrates system.
What the nature piece really drives home is that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a security issue, a food security issue, a migration issue, and potentially a nuclear security issue. The Indus system alone affects India, Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan. If cooperation breaks down, we're not just talking about water shortages, we're talking about mass displacement, agricultural collapse, and the very real possibility of armed conflict over resources.
And this connects directly to what we were just discussing about Nepal. The same Himalayan glaciers that are central to Nepal's climate crisis are the ones feeding the Indus system. The same failure of international climate finance that leaves Nepal vulnerable also leaves Pakistan and India without the resources they need for adaptation. These are not separate stories, they are the same story playing out across an entire region.
The key takeaway from nature's analysis is that we need more treaties like the Indus Waters Treaty, not fewer. We need binding international frameworks for sharing climate-stressed resources. And we need them before the water runs out, not after. Because once you're in a crisis, cooperation becomes exponentially harder. The time to build these frameworks is now, while there's still something to share.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that the World Bank played a crucial role in brokering the original Indus Waters Treaty. Today, international institutions are under attack from nationalists and populists worldwide. If we dismantle the very institutions capable of brokering these agreements, we're removing the safety net just as the tightrope gets thinner. That should terrify everyone.
Now let's turn to our final story, and it's one that's going to make your blood boil. Electrek is reporting on what they're calling Elon Musk's dirty deals, and the details are damning. The man who built his fortune on the promise of a clean energy future is now personally responsible for pumping massive amounts of pollution into the atmosphere to power his artificial intelligence ambitions.
Let's lay out the facts. Elon Musk's xAI, the company behind the Grok AI system, has been operating data centers that are generating enormous amounts of emissions. We're talking about facilities that are burning through electricity at a staggering rate, and in many cases, that electricity is coming from some of the dirtiest sources available. Electrek reports that these operations are effectively undoing years of decarbonization progress.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum. These data centers are located in communities that are bearing the health consequences of this pollution. We're talking about increased particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and other pollutants that cause respiratory disease, cardiovascular problems, and premature death. Musk is externalizing the cost of his AI ambitions onto some of the most vulnerable communities in America.
Now here's where the hypocrisy becomes absolutely breathtaking. At the same time that Musk is running these pollution-spewing data centers, Tesla, his electric vehicle company, is losing regulatory credits. For years, Tesla's business model was significantly propped up by selling zero-emission vehicle credits to other automakers who couldn't meet emission standards on their own. Those credits were worth billions of dollars to Tesla.
But as more automakers produce their own electric vehicles, partly driven by those same EU regulations we discussed earlier, the demand for Tesla's credits is dropping. Tesla is losing a major revenue stream. So on one hand, Musk's EV company is losing money because the clean energy transition is actually succeeding and competitors are catching up. On the other hand, he's personally invested in AI infrastructure that is one of the fastest growing sources of carbon emissions on the planet.
Let me say that again so it sinks in. The same man who marketed himself as the savior of the planet through electric vehicles is now building AI infrastructure that is actively accelerating climate change. And when his EV company loses the financial benefits of being a clean energy leader, he doesn't double down on sustainability, he pivots to one of the most energy-intensive and polluting industries in tech. That tells you everything you need to know about whether Musk's climate credentials were ever genuine or just profitable.
And the third piece of Electrek's reporting actually provides a hopeful counterpoint. Electric semi-trucks, not Tesla's long-delayed semi, but electric trucks in general, are saving fleet operators enormous amounts of money. The total cost of ownership data is becoming undeniable. Electric semis are cheaper to fuel, cheaper to maintain, and increasingly competitive on range and payload. The economics are winning even without the environmental arguments.
This is crucial because the freight sector accounts for a huge portion of transportation emissions. heavy-duty trucks are some of the worst polluters on our roads. If the economics of electric semis continue to improve, and every indication is that they will, we could see a massive shift in freight transportation within this decade. And that shift will happen not because of billionaire saviors, but because the technology simply works better and costs less.
And that's the real lesson in this story. The clean energy transition doesn't need Elon Musk. It never did. What it needs is smart regulation, like the EU rules we talked about earlier, and continued investment in technology that makes clean alternatives economically superior. Musk is increasingly becoming an obstacle to the transition, not a leader of it. His political alignment with fossil fuel interests, his AI emissions, and his company's declining competitive advantage all point in the same direction.
The electric semi-truck data also demolishes another fossil fuel talking point, that clean energy can't handle heavy industry. These trucks are hauling real freight, on real routes, for real companies, and they're saving money doing it. Every time someone tells you that electrification can't work for heavy-duty applications, point them to these numbers. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet.
Now, Maya, let's do what we do best on this show. Let's connect the dots between all four of these stories, because when you step back and look at the full picture, a pattern emerges that is both alarming and illuminating.
The pattern is this: everywhere we look, the climate crisis is intensifying and intersecting with existing power structures. In Nepal, climate vulnerability is driving political upheaval. In Europe, regulation is proving that clean supply chains are achievable, but only when governments have the political will to enforce them. In South Asia, climate change is turning water into a potential trigger for conflict between nuclear states. And in the United States, a billionaire is abandoning his clean energy brand to chase AI profits while polluting communities of color.
The connecting thread is accountability, or more precisely, the lack of it. Nepal's previous government was toppled because it failed to be accountable to its people on climate and governance. The EU's regulations work precisely because they create accountability mechanisms for corporations. The Indus Waters Treaty survives because it creates a framework of mutual accountability between nations. And Musk is getting away with his hypocrisy because American regulatory frameworks have been gutted and there's no accountability for his emissions.
And there's another thread here: the role of international institutions and cooperation. The Indus Waters Treaty shows that cooperation works, even between bitter enemies. The EU regulations show that multinational governance can drive real environmental progress. But both of these models are under threat from the same forces of nationalism, corporate lobbying, and authoritarian populism that are dismantling climate action worldwide.
Look at what's happening in the United States right now. The same political forces that are protecting Musk's polluting data centers are the ones working to get the EPA, withdraw from international climate agreements, and block EV incentives. It's a coordinated assault on every mechanism of accountability that could force the transition to clean energy. And it's not happening by accident. It's happening because fossil fuel interests and tech oligarchs have captured the regulatory apparatus.
Meanwhile, the people of Nepal are going to the polls hoping that democracy can deliver what their previous leaders could not: a response to the climate crisis that is already killing their neighbors and destroying their livelihoods. The farmers along the Indus are watching their water supplies shrink and wondering whether their governments will cooperate or fight. The communities near Musk's data centers are breathing polluted air and wondering when someone will hold him accountable.
This is why we do this show. Because these stories aren't separate. They're all part of the same global struggle over whether humanity will organize itself to survive the climate crisis, or whether the powerful will continue to extract profit from destruction while the vulnerable pay the price. Every single story we covered tonight comes back to that fundamental question.
And here's what gives me hope. In every single one of these stories, there are people fighting back. The protesters in Nepal who toppled a corrupt government. The EU regulators who refused to bow to corporate pressure. The scientists publishing in Nature who are shouting from the rooftops about what's coming. The journalists at Electrek who are holding Musk accountable. The trucking companies that are proving clean freight works. The resistance is real, and it's growing.
That's the truth that doesn't get enough airtime. Yes, the crisis is immense. Yes, the forces of obstruction are powerful. But the tools for change exist. Regulation works, we saw it tonight with the EU Carmaker rankings. International cooperation works, we saw it with the Indus Waters Treaty. Democratic accountability works, we saw it with Nepal's protest movement. The question isn't whether we can solve this. The question is whether we will choose to.
And that choice is made every single day, in voting booths, in corporate boardrooms, in legislative chambers, and yes, in what you choose to do with the information we've shared tonight. Stay informed. Hold power accountable. Demand better from your leaders and from the corporations that shape our world. That's not idealism, that's survival.
Before we go, let's recap. Nepal heads to the polls Thursday in an election born from climate frustration and democratic uprising. Watch that space closely. EU regulations are proving that clean EV supply chains are not only possible but already happening. Climate change and geopolitics are converging on the Indus River system, but a 60-year-old treaty shows that cooperation can survive even the worst tensions. And Elon Musk is trading his clean energy credibility for AI profits while communities choke on his pollution.
These stories matter. The connections between them matter. And you, watching this right now, you matter. This is not someone else's problem. This is our collective problem, and it demands collective action. Share this episode. Talk to your neighbors. Write to your representatives. The climate crisis will not wait for us to get comfortable.
That's all for tonight's Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never stop asking who benefits and who pays the price.
We'll see you next time.